Okay, welcome everyone to Revolutions of Industrialization as we continue with the first industrial society. Okay, massive increase in output occurred as industrialization took hold in Britain. There was a rapid development of railroad systems, and much of the dramatic increase was in mining, manufacturing, and even services. Agriculture became less important by comparison. In 1891, agriculture generated only 8% of British national income. So there's a vast transformation in daily life. It was a traumatic process for many people, and different people were affected in different ways. All right, the landowners in Great Britain remained wealthy, as only a few thousand families owned half of the cultivated land in Britain. This class remained wealthy and exerted power in Parliament. And with rapid urbanization, the demand for food remained strong. So the land-owning aristocrats had little material loss in the Industrial Revolution. But the aristocracy declined because urban wealth became more important. Many businessmen, manufacturers, and bankers were enriched. Aristocrats had declining political clout, but by 1900, businessmen led the major political parties. And the titled nobles retained great social prestige and personal wealth. And a large part of that is because many of them found an outlet in Britain's colonial possessions and were able to make money there. Okay, so here is a chart, a graph that shows the production of railroad lines. In 1830, you can see in red for each of these 6 countries or territories. And in blue, the increase in the number of railroads per kilometer, in kilometers, just over 20 years, a 20-year period. So you can see there's a significant difference. And not just in Great Britain, right? There's a huge difference, even though it doesn't look like much, in Italy and Russia, but they didn't have any railroad lines in 1830. Neither did Germany, and they increased to nearly 6,000 kilometers of railroad lines. So you could see how quickly people were producing at the beginning stages of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the middle classes had the most obvious gains from industrialization. The upper middle class soon became extremely wealthy, and they bought into that aristocratic lifestyle. Now, the middle class, there were large numbers of smaller businessmen and professionals. Generally, they were politically liberal. They stood for thriftiness, hard work, rigid morals, and cleanliness. Great example, Samuel Miles in Self-Help, written in 1859. Individuals are responsible for their own destiny. So you reap the benefits from your choices or the consequences from your choices. And middle-class women were more frequently cast as homemakers, wives, and mothers. So the term middle class includes a wide variety of people. At the upper end were industrialists, bankers, entrepreneurs who amassed these large fortunes and entered the social world of the declining aristocracy. Now they sought the various markers of social privilege, such as knighthoods and other royal honors that the landed elite had once monopolized. Now, like I said, they're politically liberal. The common ideology of the middle class was classical liberalism, a belief in small government, education, and the law is guaranteed by constitutions. And in Samuel Smiles' Self-Help, this was one of the most famous examples of British middle-class liberal ideology. The book stressed hard work and self-reliance, arguing that poverty was due to a lack of trying and a lack of thrift. Now, the lower middle class, this was the service sector of workers, clerks, secretaries, occupations like that. And by 1900, there were around 20% of Britain's population. And there were some employment opportunities for women as well as men. Now, women were still considered the paragons of respectability, and according to the middle class, British ideal respectable women should not work and should concern themselves with the domestic sphere, and such new consumer activities as shopping. Now, while these women left the labor force in the early 19th century, by the end of the century, an increasing number of young middle-class women sought work in office, like secretaries and clerks. Now, generally, they expected to work a few years before marrying, and in the home, the key sign of middle-class respectability was having at least one servant. Let's look at the laboring classes. In the 19th century, about 70% of Britons were workers. The laboring classes suffered the most and benefited the least from industrialization. Now, let's look at rapid urbanization. By 1851, a majority of Britain's population was urban, and by 1900, just less than 50 years later, London was the largest city in the world with approximately 6 million people. But there were horrible urban conditions. It was vastly overcrowded, inadequate sanitation and water supplies. There were epidemics and diseases. A few public services were available and very few open spaces. And there was little contact between the rich and the poor. So the working in the cities and towns and villages, in factories and mines and farms, the working classes made up the majority of British society. But they suffered the most and gained the least from this process of industrialization. Now, their lives were dramatically impacted by the process of rapid urbanization. Like I said, in 1851, in a moment that marked a turning point in world history, majority of Britons now live in cities at this point. And at the end of the century, with 6 million inhabitants, made London the world's largest city. But unfortunately, rapid urbanization resulted in relatively poor city planning, if it was even planned at all. And living conditions were cramped and dirty. Like I said, epidemic diseases ran rampant, and it took a terrible toll on the urban poor. And the industrial factories offered a very different work environment. Long hours, low wages, child labor, all typical for the poor. And what was new was the routine and the monotony of work, direct supervision, discipline, things like that. And industrial work was actually insecure work. Many girls and young women worked, and the gendered hierarchy of labor in factories with men held positions of supervisors in more skilled positions. So in addition to new housing situations and the overcrowdedness, the British working class experienced new and often difficult working conditions as well. Those long hours were nothing new to British workers, but the enclosed factories, which were often dark and cold and dank, were a dramatic contrast to the farms and the small artisan workshops of the previous century. Furthermore, the near constant surveillance by management seeking to extract the most labor possible per hour angered many who desired more independence and freedom and respect within the workplace. But we do see more women and girls in factories. In the early 19th century, many factory managers preferred women and young girls as laborers because they were viewed as not as likely to challenge orders and to challenge authority. However, as the industrial workforce grew, male workers pushed women out of the factories and into least prestigious, unskilled jobs. Working class women generally found work in factories or as domestic servants until marriage, and then they left the workforce to raise children. So let's talk about social protest. There were friendly societies, especially of artisans for self-help, that were pretty common among the masses. Other skilled artisans sometimes wrecked machinery and burned mills. Some joined political movements and aimed to enfranchise working class men, and trade unions were finally legalized in 1824. There's a growing number of factory workers that joined trade unions, and they fought for better wages and working conditions. And at first, the upper classes really feared the idea of trade unions. They were viewed as a serious threat in the first decades of the century, and unions didn't achieve legal status until 1824. And so, but even then, they were still viewed with suspicion, if not outright hostility, by factory and mine owners, who feared nationwide organizing and use of strikes to achieve the workers' goals. But eventually, socialist ideas began to spread throughout the populace. Robert Owen established an ideal industrial community in New Lanark, Scotland. An early experimenter in the form of socialism, this wealthy textile manufacturer created a model industrial community in Scotland, and he promoted decent and spacious housing, higher wages, and even education for all children. Karl Marx laid out a full ideology of socialism, and it's sometimes referred to as scientific socialism. Karl Marx was a German man who spent most of his adult life in Britain, actually, where he developed his radical critiques of capitalism and history and revolutionary change. And he called upon the revolutionary tradition of the French Revolution and merged it with a scientific analysis of history to argue that capitalism was inherently unstable and would collapse in the flames of the worldwide workers' revolution. But he failed to foresee the rise of a large middle class of white-collar workers and the spread of nationalism. And both forces weakened the revolutionary potential of Britain and other industrializing societies. And his followers would form a variety of political parties, with the communists being some of the most radical. And these socialist ideas were attractive among more radical trade unionists and even some middle-class intellectuals as we get in further into the late 19th century. Now, the British working class movement remained relatively moderate. Material conditions for workers improved in the second half of the century, while capitalists and the impoverished working class didn't polarize because of the large and lower middle classes. And the workers bettered their standard of living. And, we talked about nationalism in chapter 16, but nationalism, for what it meant for revolutionary change and political change, but nationalism bound workers to countries rather than other workers around the world. So it also worked in this new way. But the huge inequalities remained. And by 1900, Britain was in economic decline relative to the newly industrialized states like Germany and the United States. Okay, let's look at this image. I think this is a fantastic visual representation of the Industrial Revolution and the workers and the different classes. So let's look at the social classes that's on this poster, and it's from 1911. Let's talk about the roots of this visualization of social structure. Okay, the top of the social pyramid shows a big sack with dollar signs. Right. Below it are two men in suits, probably bankers or some type of industrialists, and a king. And below them stand the clergy from different Christian denominations. And farther below are soldiers ready for combat. And one step down are a group of nicely dressed people drinking and eating generously at some large banquet table. And at the very bottom are a large number of men, women, and children in working clothes who are supporting the entire structure. And this pyramid structure first emerged as an illustration of European class society on the eve of the French Revolution. And here, the magazine for the industrial workers of the world adopted the metaphor and applied it to capitalism rather than the feudal order. But it's a brilliant image to represent the different industrial classes, right? We work for all, we feed all, right? The pyramid of capitalist system, right? These people, we eat for you, we shoot at you, we fool you, we rule you. And that's capitalism. So now, according to this illustration, how does capitalism work? Well, capitalism supported the rulers, right? The bankers, the industrialists, the kings, the remaining nobility. They also relied on the clergy to distract people from issues of class conflict, right? Keep them busy and distracted. Then on the military to forcefully suppress class conflict. And on a broadening middle class benefited from worker exploitation, and finally the workers at the bottom who continued to produce the goods and services that were consumed by everyone else. Now, how secure does the position of the upper classes seem to be here? Well, the rulers of this pyramid seem confident, right? So do the clergy. The military and the middle class, they all seem well-to-do, ready to go. But the workers at the bottom, however, are coming out from under the pyramid, shouting and gesturing upwards, waving these red flags, and they seem ready to abandon their positions. If this were to happen, of course, the whole pyramid would topple and bring down those at the top. Just a brilliant image. Very clever. Okay, Europeans in motion. All right, a massive migratory process uprooted millions of people, millions of Europeans, setting them in motion both internally and around the world. Half or more of the rural population in Europe migrated to cities, and 20% of Europeans between 1815 and 1939 left Europe. So migration to cities and even other continents is what begins to happen in Britain in the last part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Industrialization induced several massive waves of migration. Just over half of the European population migrated to cities. Even more impressive was the departure of 20% of the population to overseas destinations. That was approximately 50 to 55 million people, which is a significant number of the world's population. And it temporarily increased Europe's share of the world's population, and the greatest impact was in the Americas. Emigration to Latin America changed the social makeup of many of the regions, and emigration to the United States was larger and more diverse than anywhere else. And it became part of the American myth, this idea of the melting pot. The European immigration into the Russian Empire happened as well. 10 million or more migrated to Siberia from Russia and the Ukraine, which before people were leaving Siberia, now they're migrating to Siberia. So Europeans settled in, and it wasn't just the Americas or Latin America, they settled in Australia and New Zealand, overwhelming the local populations there and creating distant versions of Britain. In Algeria, South Africa, Rhodesia, Kenya, and other places, smaller populations set up settler colonies and instituted sharp racial divisions. And white Europeans in Latin America, specifically Southern and Central European immigrants from Spain and Portugal and Italy, all benefited from being white and achieved superior social status to the Indian and mixed or African populations that already existed in Latin America. Okay, and here's a visual representation of those migration patterns. We see over 32 million people leave Europe to the United States. 7 million people leave Asian Russia, or go to Asian Russia, from Europe. And And look at this, over 6 million people just to Argentina, and more than 4.5 million to Brazil from Europe. Over 4 million people from Europe migrate to Canada. Nearly 3 million migrate to Australia, and 650,000 to New Zealand. 600,000 to Uruguay, to Cuba, and even 250,000 to South Africa and Mexico. So, even though the percentages might sound like a very small part of the population, when you look at the actual numbers, that's a very large number of people moving in, this 100-year period, just shy of the beginning of World War II. So we see a lot of people moving, and a large part of that is because of the process of industrialization. They went where the opportunities were. So after that huge wave of labor systems moving and laborers not migrating, but being forced from their homes in Africa, when slavery ends, now we see a different kind of shift of labor systems and migrations. With indentured servitudes and the Industrial Revolution, as people are looking for different or new economic opportunities. Okay, thanks, and I will see you guys for the next section. That's our comparison of industrialization in the United States and Russia.